Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for Community Project Funding Grantees. I'm Randall Mullen with TDA Consulting, and I will further introduce myself and the co-presenter momentarily. Before we begin presenting the content, though, I first want to cover a few logistics. If you've participated in a prior CPF webinar, you probably know this detail. All participants will be muted during the presentation, so you will participate in so-called listen mode. As is customary, the PowerPoint presentation will be available on the HUD Exchange soon after the webinar. You will find the slides on the CPF cohort landing page. Although you will participate in listen mode, we still want you to be actively engaged. You may submit content-related questions using the chat feature of Zoom, sending those questions to everyone. The co-presenter and I will monitor the chat and answer clarifying questions when possible as they're asked during the presentations. We will also pause at the end of each section of today's webinar, read aloud those frequently asked questions, and orally answer them for all to hear. As in the prior webinars, we have reserved a time for questions and answers, a Q&A period, toward the end of the webinar, where we'll invite any HUD representatives who have joined us to answer the more difficult questions or clarify answers we presenters have provided in earlier responses as necessary. Here is the agenda that we'll follow today. As I mentioned, it will begin with introductions followed by an overview of the cohort, a general description of the project narrative, this session, and then it will cover its format, as well as discuss the specific content of that narrative, including the project description, metrics, timeline and status, and proposed subrecipients. After we cover those key content areas, we'll do an activity, followed by the Q&A period where we'll orally address answers and answer questions that have not been previously answered in the chat with help from HUD. Lastly, we'll provide you with a homework assignment. I'll begin the introductions and then tag my co-presenter who will introduce himself, and he will then in turn tag what we hope will be a couple HUD representatives who we had anticipated would join us today. Again, my name is Randall Mullen, and I'm with TDA Consulting, where I've worked for many years as both Vice President and Senior Consultant on a wide range of housing and community development projects. I recently assisted HUD in explaining guidance around special congressional appropriations. That work has included both recovery from natural disasters and response to the COVID-19 pandemic, plus recovery from its associated economic impacts, and now the CPF program. The co-presenter today is Chad Carson. Chad, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello. Thanks, Randall. My name's Chad Carson. I am with Civics and have been working in the federal grants arena now close to a decade, mostly in the disaster recovery context, but also some other areas as well. And I'm looking forward to helping y'all with your narratives today.
Okay, and we also wanted to introduce Connor LaRoe from HUD, who was possibly going to join us.
Randall, we've got
we have
Chantal James.
Okay, Chantal is with us. Chantal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Chantal James. I'm the Deputy Director of the Congressional Grants Division. Sorry, Connor won't be with you today. He is in a similar cohort that's going on right now. We're very happy to be able to provide this resource to you, and I hope you find it helpful. I believe I also have my colleague, Grant Officer and Team Lead Vaughn Watson on as well.
Okay, Vaughn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Vaughn Watson. I am a grant officer and also acting team lead on a detail rotation here in the Congressional Grants Division. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to being able to further assist you in your grant process.
Okay, well, Vaughn, we're pleased to have you with us and honored to have the Deputy Director of this office in the Department of HUD, Chantal. So pleased that you could make it.
Thanks, Randall. Happy to be here.
Okay, this CPF cohort is assembled for us to provide specific guidance that will assist you in the satisfactory completion of all necessary grant materials. You were invited to join this cohort based on your award of a CPF grant. Session 1 today will specifically assist you with the completion of the required information that leads to the execution of your grant agreement, and then in turn allows you to begin initiating your special project. Your cohort will learn today about the project narrative, and then you will attend 3 additional sessions, each at 2-week intervals as shown here. The additional sessions will cover the budget, environmental review, and the necessary forms which your community must complete as part of the HUD required grant materials. And we do want to emphasize that today's session is solely on the topic of project narrative. To facilitate support of this cohort, you're enrolled in a learning management system called Absorb, which is hosted by TDA Consulting. This system will eventually extend beyond the delivery of the presentations to on the 4 different topics. The LMS feature will permit us to share with you useful resources, as well as continue to serve as a platform for other sessions and office hours appointments that are offered to grantees. We'll now turn our attention to the key narrative content areas I previewed earlier. I will briefly address the project description, and then Chad will cover other of the related areas. If you're just starting to complete your grant materials or you've been working on them a while, you probably realize that there's no prescribed format for the project narrative. It's understandable that you might get stuck along the way. All the required content will cover several typewritten pages. However, HUD recognizes that you'll begin with essentially a blank page, and that itself can be a challenge for either starting or completing the necessary project description. Our best advice is to refer you, of course, to the CPF instructions, including those in the CPF grant guide shown here, which details the required content. You may also refer to the standard form used for federal grant applications, that is the SF-424, and you may use this presentation as an outline for drafting your narrative. The graphic appearing on the side of this slide, as well as the presentation Chad and I are delivering, follow an outline structure that you may adapt for your project narrative. Again, it's not a prescribed format, but you'll find it useful, particularly if you haven't started yet. Those who have already begun preparing their application probably recognize the outline as it closely aligns with the CPF grant guide. Okay, we'll now discuss the detailed content for the project description, beginning with the narrative, which includes the name, address, purpose, and details that fully describe your project. A satisfactory project description begins with the seemingly simple task of identifying the community's project name. The project name and other descriptive information must encompass the full scope of the project in its entirety. This is essential for HUD to review your grant package and the related materials. You will also need for information to inform the level of environmental review necessary to gain clearance for your project. And that information must tie back to and match the Joint Explanatory Statement, the JES, of the congressional appropriation, unless corrected or amended. I'll elaborate on this last point momentarily. Because there are literally thousands of these community project funding grants since Congress resumed appropriating funds for such uses, the description must also precisely identify the project location. You may provide an address if it is available. Otherwise, GPS coordinates are acceptable. You'll see in this example that we have planted a stake in the center of Washington, D.C., using its coordinates that may be recognized by the HUD representatives with us today. You're also encouraged to include a map depicting the site of your project that it enhances the project description. The narrative must also clearly describe your project's purpose. This may be as simple as a one-sentence summary describing what the project seeks to accomplish. However, in all cases, you absolutely must use language from the project scope appearing in the congressional record as part of the JES. For example, if the JES describes construction of Gateway Plaza in your community, the narrative should also describe a proposed appropriation of funds for the construction of Gateway Plaza. HUD has provided these examples of acceptable purpose statements appearing in submitted grant packages. The Community Foundation at Indiana will construct a 12,000 square foot community center in Peoria, Illinois. The city of Omaha will launch a Main Street revitalization program, renovating facades of historic storefronts in East Main Street. The town of Gatlinburg will create an updated stormwater management plan. The full narrative then may summarize the entire project, restating its purpose, and most importantly, identifying activity categories and specific uses of the grant funds. Examples of this slide will illustrate that point, but first I want to emphasize you must describe all actions undertaken as part of the project, regardless of the funding source. HUD recognizes many projects will benefit from other funding sources, such as the Community Development Block Grant Program, and they will contribute to the full scope and impact of your project. As such, this content area comprises the bulk of your narrative. Now, what are these examples? Affordable rental housing, capacity building, clearance and demolition, and so on. They're common activity categories for a wide range of housing and community development projects. Use such activity categories as they will be helpful in the setup of your project within HUD's DRGR Management Information System, once your grant agreement is signed and its funds can be spent. When you have finished drafting the project narrative, we advise you then to just sit back and ask yourself these three questions, which cover topics of potentially significant content. 1, did you include the congressional award language? 2, what pre-award costs, if any, are you seeking to reimburse under the grant agreement? And 3, was a federal environmental review completed prior to starting? Lastly, I want to mention the possibility of technical corrections to the congressional appropriation. As this slide states, if the JES has an error or if the project has substantially changed since announcement, some projects will require technical correction. You should discuss any such issues with the grantee name, project name, or description with your grant officer. If a technical correction has been made, describe the change that was made, including the specific change and the reason it was needed. Okay, that's it for the project narrative part of the presentation. I'll now turn the remainder of the presentation over to Chad. Chad?
All right, thanks, Randall. Let me get that pulled up here and switched over. There we go.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to be covering goals, outcomes, and objectives in your narrative. All the projects have to have clearly stated goals and outcomes. HUD does not prescribe what you're using as your metrics here. They just have to make sense to tell the story of your project. They should be quantifiable so you can determine if you've completed them or not. For example, hold 6 community meetings to gather feedback on the city plan. So the 6 are countable. Construct 10 miles of walking path, for example, or train 60 small business owners. You all know your project best, so HUD has put you in the driver's seat for choosing how you measure your success. The next area of performance measures relates to Section 3. Some of you might be familiar with Section 3. It's Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. And it applies to any projects that involve housing rehab, housing construction, or other public construction projects. And it requires the hiring of low-income individuals in the area that the project is being completed. This will apply to some of your projects, and if it does, you should reference it in your narrative. Reference acknowledging that Section 3 you've determined is applicable. And while you don't have to put in your performance measures into this part of your narrative, you will eventually need to input them into DRGR, which is the reporting system for this program. And you're going to be required to estimate, set goals for, and then eventually report on the total number of labor hours, the number of Section 3 labor hours, which is a subset of that, and then one more subset, which is the targeted Section 3 labor hours. HUD has put together a great resource that's linked at the bottom of this slide. It's the DRGR guidance on reporting Section 3 labor hours. So you can really take a deeper dive into the topic at that resource. If you have any questions about the applicability of Section 3 to your project, that's a topic that your grant officer can definitely help you with. Another regulatory issue that you should mention in your narrative if it applies to you is BABA. It is the Build America, Buy America Act. BABA requires that essentially all construction materials and manufactured products that are used in public works with federal funding are made in America. HUD has a general waiver for fiscal year 2023 grantees from BABA. So that's great. It's going to streamline the projects. If you are anticipating additional funding sources outside of just the community project fund funding, or you anticipate funding in a later round like 2024, then you might have to comply with BABA. But if your project is limited only to the fiscal year 2023 CPF funding, then you can take advantage of that general waiver. Examples of community project fund projects that would be considered infrastructure projects, according to BABA, we've got a list there. It pretty much follows along with the standard definition of infrastructure. We're talking about buildings, public facilities, utilities, etc. Next up, we're going to cover timeline and project status. You want to make sure that your narrative explains what the current status of your project is. The current status is super important for your grant officer to understand so that they can give you good guidance on any regulatory compliance issues that will come up. So be sure to write in a succinct explanation of where your project currently stands. It might be anywhere from conception all the way to completion. And we know that we have projects anywhere in that lifespan, probably on this call today. So be sure to address the current status. Maybe your project is in the very beginning ideas phase where there's no contracts or agreements executed. Maybe you've gone a little bit farther and started procurement. Maybe construction's underway. Or perhaps it's even complete. Now, we're going to talk more about environmental in just a second, but if your project is underway and you haven't done a federal environmental review, you need to talk to your regional environmental officer as soon as possible, as well as your grant officer. In terms of timeline, you want to talk about the current status. You also want to provide a start date and an end date for the project. We know that these are best estimates at this stage, but assuming the project goes to plan, when do you think it's going to begin? How long is it going to take? When's it going to finish? As I mentioned, environmental review is also key to address here. All of these projects have to comply with NEPA requirements. That's National Environmental Policy Act. And regardless of what the activities undertaken are, you need some type of environmental clearance. That could range from something very simple for planning only projects to something more comprehensive for construction projects. You want to include in your narrative what the status of your environmental review is. Again, maybe you haven't done one yet. Maybe you are all done with an environmental assessment, a very comprehensive environmental review. Just make sure that you are including that in your narrative. If this is not resonating with you, if this is not ringing any bells, or if you have questions, please reach out to your regional environmental officer, and you can talk about what steps are needed in order for you to get your project's environmental review underway. We've got a link there to the contact information for the HUD environmental staff. We will also have that on a resource slide towards the end of the presentation. The last narrative content area relates to subrecipients. If you plan on subgranting any of the funds to other nonprofits or units of local government, then that is a subrecipient relationship. And if you plan on doing that, you need to include a description of what you're doing with subrecipients in your narrative. You need to describe why the project is best implemented using subrecipients instead of directly by the grantee, and describe everyone's role and scope in the project. What will the grantee be doing? What will the subrecipient be doing? And why is each best equipped to do that work? If you don't have a subrecipient, if you are not going to be using subrecipients, then you don't need to touch on this.
Chad, before you advance to the next slide, we do have a few questions concerning what you've covered as well as what I covered.
Sure.
One is from Dante Hickman, who asks, can you provide the name and contact information for our grant officer?
We definitely can. And we've got a full sheet linked with assignments based on what state the project is in. And we will drop that link into the chat.
Right.
probably during Q&A at the end or whenever I'm finished presenting my slides.
Okay, and we also had a couple of questions that I answered concerning my part of the presentation, and I thought maybe we would take time to respond to those questions for the benefit of everyone because they do cover some of the key points of our presentation. Christine asked if, I'll go back to her question here. Is there a benefit to limiting the project scope to only what our CPF funds will fund? And I indicated to her, and you could elaborate on this if you wish, that no, she should describe the full scope of the project, including all funding sources. And I think you touched on this in respect to how important that is related to the environmental review. And I'll point out that it will be important for the budget, and you'll hear repeated advice to that effect in the next session. But did you want to say anything in regard to Christine's question?
Yeah, let me add that it's important that you frame your project in terms of what's written into the JES, as well as explaining any larger context that it fits into, if that makes sense.
It does.
So,
it does.
Good.
And then we had a question from Jocelyn Borchardt, if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. What makes a change, quote, substantial, end quote? For example, would a housing project changing its unit mix qualify as a substantial change? And I responded indicating that a change in housing mix of units probably wouldn't be a substantial change, but a change in the location, the tenure type, or the target households might. And I want to point out that if, for example, the housing mix changes substantially to the point that the purpose of the project is no longer, let's say, rental housing for low and moderate income households, then that probably would become a substantial change. And what we're going to point out to you, particularly in the activity, is how important it is that you look back at the activity descriptions that appeared on the slide that I shared, which actually are the common activity description or phrases that are used for housing and community development projects. And those are those activity descriptions from which you would select in a pull-down menu within DRGR to set up your grant and then be able to draw funds from the grant. Consequently, if your housing project is referring to construction of new housing, rental housing, you would want to use that activity as opposed to housing rehabilitation of single-family homes. And we have a couple of other questions that have come in since I began looking earlier. Is radon testing review now required in the environmental review?
I can take that. So that is something that would be best addressed with your grant officer and regional environmental officer. The answer to that is that it varies based on region and site by site. So please go ahead and reach out to your regional environmental officer about that one.
And we have a related question from Ken Berry, but a related question from Nicholas Wallover. I submitted our proposal and signed agreement back in December, but haven't heard anything from the HUD project manager. Perhaps Nicholas is referring to the grant officer. And then he further asks, or the environmental review specialist. is there something that I need to do as a recipient to initiate the review process? And I'm going to ask Vaughn Watson, if he, as a grant officer, if he wants to take that question, or if he's uncertain of the answer, maybe Chantal from HUD could answer that question.
Chantal, do you want to address it, or would you like Fry to address it?
Sure, either or. Let me just, you said that you have a fully executed grant agreement, correct? Is that
Yes.
what? Yes. Okay. So you should have, or at least the authorized representative for your grant that's listed on the documents that you sent over should have received login credentials to use our DRGR system, Disaster Recovery Grants Management System. Are you the authorized rep on the account?
This person is on mute, so let's assume that the answer is yes.
Sorry about that. Very, very appreciative of the time with my question. Thank you. So I am the authorized representative. And when we submitted in December, we received an automated reply from CPF grants, I guess it's at HUD.gov, just saying that it had been received, but we had never received anything from either the environmental or program manager that we had worked with. And they never received any credentials to log in to initiate the environmental process. I know of that, of the DRGM, I believe it was.
DRGR.
That I know that's how we kind of work through the environmental process, but I never received any credentials related to it.
Okay, so the DRGR system is different from environmental. So environmental, you will have to work with your regional environmental officer. They use a separate system for environmental called Heroes. And that kind of is a linear process, right? Like you work on your environmental simultaneously while working on the rest of your grant. So to move, if you could give me your grant number here.
Oh, absolutely.
But you are saying that you never received credentials for DRGR, but you did receive a signed grant agreement from HUD, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, yeah, if you can give me your grant number.
Yeah, so Nicholas, please just enter that information in the chat for Chantal, yes. and she will find out the full answer.
Thank you so much, both of you.
And we also have a related question, Chad, from Dante. Phasing the project and doing half the number of units in the first phase, is that a substantial change, or are we able to draw the entire grant for the first phase? Dante, I'll try to answer your question. It depends on what is the scope of the project described in your application as specified in the congressional appropriation. So if you're trying to determine if there's a substantial change in regard to a possible need for a technical correction, we would urge you to contact your grant officer and discuss the details. But as a general instruction, HUD wants for the grantee to describe the full scope of the project, even though there may be, say, a phase that is not yet fully funded, but if it is part of the full scope of the project, it would help to complete an environmental review that is sufficient to cover the entirety of the project. And there's the reason why we would urge you to also make contact with the environmental review officer. Looks like we have another question related to the submission of forms. Mary Alvarez indicates that she submitted documents, forms, agreement with narrative and budget in July and hasn't heard back from HUD. Her program officer, which I presume is the grant officer, stated that it was in review as of January. So I would say, Mary Alvarez, it's good that you actually have learned from your grant officer as of last month, January, that the project is under review. What we would urge you to do is stay in contact with that grant officer, in as much as you apparently did learn in that manner what the status was, and it had moved into the review period. What I'll also point out, and Chantal could probably elaborate on this if we have time, that the Department of HUD recognizes that a significant number of grants have been funded through the congressional appropriations, and they are increasing their capacity by adding grant officers and even a surge team to address the fact that there was an earlier congressional appropriation in fiscal year 22, and now there's the one you're participating in from fiscal year 23. And what you just found out, Mary Alvarez, is probably indicative of the fact that that HUD is increasing its ability to respond and review these grant proposals in a timely fashion. And Chad, I think I'm sorry, did you want to add something, Chantal?
Oh, no, Randall. Thank you. Yeah, if you submitted documents in January of this year, am I hearing that correctly?
No, what it was actually a two-part question. Mary Alvarez said she submitted documents in July and hadn't heard back until this January. And her grant officer then stated that the package was under review. So there was a lag perhaps from what Mary Alvarez expected, but her grant package is now under review as I read this. Mary Alvarez, if that's not what you are saying here, please do clarify.
Hi, this is Mary. Yes, I guess I'm trying to understand where my project is in the process, and then also going through this cohort has it gone through a review, and maybe more information is needed because that hasn't been conveyed. So I guess I'm a little confused in the process is what I'm trying to convey.
Understood. Thanks, Mary. As certainly, if you submitted complete materials in July, or even if you didn't and you didn't hear back for your grant officer, I do apologize for that. Frequently, we do receive submissions that have items that need to be corrected on behalf of the grantee that we do send back that you would get from your grant officer. But you should have heard from your grant officer during that time. As Randall stated, we do have a lot more resources. We do have over 2,600 grantees and a staff of about 17 grant officers. As of now, we have a surge team that's actually come on to help us review packages. So we have upped our staffing. We also have cooperating partners such as TDA on this call to be able to provide technical assistance. So it has been a journey in getting the bandwidth and capacity to be able to execute these grants. I will say, if your grant officer told you that your package is under review as of January, you should be hearing something back, whether that be a fully executed grant agreement or if there's deficiencies in your package. When we are fully staffed, we generally hope to be able to provide a turnaround within 60 to 75 days to review a complete package. Again, those timelines have, depending on bandwidth and staffing, as often went over or under, but I would coordinate with your grant officer in terms of the timeline that your grant officer anticipates. I think if you were told in January, I would give it a couple of weeks, but you can feel free to reach out at any time. Each grants officer has a different queue in their review on when particularly your package might be in review. I hope that helps. I definitely recommend reaching out to your grant officers to see if you can get an idea of timelines. If it's in review, though, you should hear something within the next couple of weeks or less.
Thank you. I appreciate the update.
Yes, that was very helpful, Chantal. We do have a question, Chad, concerning BABA, the question is from Megan, who asked, we were awarded in 2023, not yet executed, and are still receiving funds for the total project from additional sources. As a result, do we need to comply with that act?
Good question. So a couple things for you to ask yourself about your project that will help determine the answer. One, does it meet the definition of an infrastructure project or public work under BABA? Our slide on BABA had a list of examples, but if you're not quite sure, I would suggest that you look into the HUD guidance offered on BABA to figure out if your project meets the definition. If it does, then the next thing to look at is what is the source of your additional funding. If it's not a federal source, then you don't need to worry about BABA because that is specific to federal funds on qualified projects. But if you've got a qualified project that meets that definition and the additional funds are federal, then you likely have BABA to comply with. But this is a great thing, again, to run past your grant officer if you are uncertain.
And then, Chad, we had a question you noted about a timeline extension, and did you want to answer that one as well?
I would, yes. So Dante Hickman said our earmark for Southern Views was awarded during the first cycle of earmarks. Will we need to apply for an extension or just go through the process being shared today? I'm going to defer to the HUD folks on this call. If you can speak to the timelines associated with this grant and whether or not an extension is needed at this point.
Hi, this is Vaughn with HUD. To address the concern, if you're and this is 2022 grantee or 2023 grantee?
Should be a 2023 grantee.
Yes, 2023.
Okay. For 2023 grantee, you have 8 years to fully expend these funds. So you guys were awarded, your appropriation was approved December 29th of 2022. You have until August 31st of 2031 to expend all of these funds. So an extension for these projects is not needed. You have, again, until August 31st of 2031 to have your project into fully executed grant agreement and to utilize and draw down all of these funds. So an extension is not needed. Now, if you're looking to change from what the JES has stated for your project, then that will go under a technical correction.
Thank you, Vaughn. And that's probably a good segue for us to continue the presentation. I did note that I think there might have been one other very specific question that had several details. And I want to, if you don't mind, whoever raised that question, we'll try to get back to that question during the Q&A period, time permitting. And also note that for each of these sessions, there will be a 90-minute office hours session that Chad and I will facilitate, where we will not be presenting information as much as addressing specific questions in detail with the help of not just one, but a few grant officers, not necessarily your own grant officer, but those who have insight into how to deal with some of the more detailed questions that can really only be answered once we have a full understanding of the context of the question that you ask. So please avail yourself of the office hours. And if there were questions that you didn't hear were answered yet when we paused at this stage, we'll try to take them up in the Q&A period. Chad, back to you.
Thanks, Randall. So we just finished on subrecipients, and now it's time for an activity.
It's time for an activity. Yes, indeed. And for the activity, I wish to note for everyone to observe that this concerns the project description offered by a particular sample grantee. Appearing on the slide is a sample project description, and as well as two other elements that we will then engage you to help solve. As I explained earlier, a grantee's project description should identify the exact activity, entire scope, sources of funding, and other details which tie back to the congressional appropriation. The column on the left identifies a fish hatchery project. You can see at the title, it has a very long name, but I'll refer to it as the Fish Hatchery Project. And it's commonly referred to as Bertram's Garden. The grantee has correctly summarized their project, indicating that the funds will design and construct a new watershed education and restoration complex on previously acquired land. And I draw your attention to the highlighted text there where it explains that this new facility will be built on previously acquired land at Bertram's Gardens. You see then under the center column an excerpt from the congressional record, which lists the joint explanatory statement appropriating funds to the John Bertram Association in the amount of $2 million. We have redacted and modified the identity of this particular grantee to avoid embarrassing them about their situation. But I want to call to your attention in that first column, what is also highlighted is that acronym, the acronym for the name of the Fish Hatchery Project, and the activity description in a two-word phrase that says the $2 million will be appropriated or are appropriated and must be used for land acquisition. So as the grantee's representative, if you were Bertram's Gardens, what do you think would be the appropriate grantee action in this case? There are three choices shown here in red. A is to submit the project description in the grant application as is. B is to contact the grant officer for guidance. And C is to request that a member of Congress intervene. We'll now launch a poll with assistance from the TDA staff, and you may indicate your answer, A, B, or C. And we have roughly 90 people participating, so we'll try to get up to about 2/3, Chad, before we reveal the results.
Sounds good. We just got over
you all
half.
are responding very quickly. Okay, it looks
Almost
like
there.
the number is kind of tapered off. So
there we go.
Looks like people have been listening, Chad. What do we see here?
It does. So we got 81% said contact the grant officer for guidance.
Yes, that is what I see as well. So we can stop sharing this poll and advance to the next slide, and I will discuss that correct action. To summarize the discussion on this activity, we determined that the narrative for Bertram Gardens appeared to be complete. However, that narrative does not match the JES and the congressional record. Because HUD must execute grants in accordance with congressional intent conveyed through the grantee name and project description, that activity description in the JES, action is necessary to correct the discrepancy. And the correct grantee action for Bertram Gardens will depend on circumstances of their case. But what we have tried to share with you in this example suggests that the correct answer is to contact the grant officer for guidance. This may lead to changes in the project description before it's submitted with the grant application package, better aligning the use of the funds. Requesting a member of Congress to intervene would only complicate things. Consequently, the correct answer that most of you did indicate is for Bertram Gardens to contact its grant officer in regard to this matter. Okay, Chad, back to you.
All right, so here's the resource slide that I promised. I just want to run through each of these resources real quickly so that you understand what's out there to help you out and get started with your project and answering some of the questions that you might have. So I'm going to run through these real quick. Just bear with me 1 second. All right, so the first resource that I'd like to show is this list of grant officers and regional environmental officers. So this is the latest and greatest who you should be reaching out to if you need to get in touch with your grant officer, who your grant officer is, and who your environmental point of contact is. So it's by state. We will drop this link in the chat if you do not already have it. And yeah, there have been some reassignments since the program began. So make sure you're referring to this list if you are curious who your project is assigned to. The next resource I wanted to show is the community project funding page on the HUD Exchange. So this is your home for everything community project funding related. You have your grant guides, you have links to the JES, the Joint Explanatory Statement, FAQs, links for DRGR, and links for asking a question. This is a great place to start your search for any information that you might need. The next
Chad,
one,
if I might add one other comment
yeah.
here, we do have the usual questions that relate to the various resources, including the presentation slides and transcript for this session. And that slide deck, as well as the transcript, will be posted to the HUD Exchange at the CPF grant landing page, where you can identify a choice, as I shared earlier in a slide screenshot of your appropriation. There's one set for FY22 and then another for FY23 grantees, and then you can find the cohort you are a part of, which is cohort 3, and this set of slides and the transcript will be posted there as soon as they've been delivered and cleared for accessibility under Section 508.
Thanks, Randall. And that area that he's referring to is under grant support here. We've got information for the cohorts posted here. These are the fall cohorts, but your cohort will be posted when the materials are available.
Yes.
The next resource I wanted to show is the grant guide. The grant guide is essentially your how-to within this program. There's 2 versions. There's one for each fiscal year of the appropriations. So most folks on this call are likely fiscal year 2023. So make sure that you're grabbing the appropriate version of the guide. So it's a PDF. It's pretty lengthy, 46 pages. Lots of questions that you have if you're just getting started will be answered in this document. So take a look, familiarize yourself with it, and it can be your jumping off point. The next resource, this is a little duplicative, but it's the HUD environmental staff contacts. So if you have an environmental question, yes, you can use the first sheet that I showed here. It shows who your regional environmental officer is. This website shows a little bit more contact information, including phone numbers that you can use to get in touch with your regional environmental officer. This list is displayed by HUD region, so just make sure that you're getting the right region when you're looking up who your regional environmental officer is. And then the last resource I wanted to point to is the HUD Ask a Question portal, or AAQ, as we call it. These are essentially like a help desk where you can submit a ticket and get an answer to a specific question. You can see here they have Community Project Fund listed as one of the programs that this tool can be used for. And you can just scroll down and enter in your information and your question, send it off, and a HUD representative will respond to you. This is a great tool if you have a one-off question that you need answered that's specific to regulations or your project or anything of the sort. Or even if you are having trouble getting in touch with your grant officer, this can be a way to submit your question and get an answer. So it's a great tool to use, and I encourage you all to take advantage of it if you have any questions. And let me just navigate back to my slide deck. There we go. So the last resource listed here is the CPF desk guides, and that is still coming soon. These are going to be built out of the feedback that we get in these very cohort sessions. We want to build a tool that will answer the sort of questions that are brought up, the sticking points that you all are experiencing in getting your projects submitted and moving forward. So please stay tuned. Each one of these subject areas that there's a cohort for will eventually have an accompanying desk guide, and we will certainly let you know when that resource is released. All right, so it looks like we've made it to questions and answers. Randall, do you want to go through how we'll handle this part?
Yes, we have almost, well, we do have 30 minutes left and can try to go through the remaining questions. And I have noted that we do have ongoing questions about contact with the grant officer and interest in trying to overcome difficulty in gaining the necessary guidance that you may feel you require. And I believe Chantal has offered, along with comments that I made, the extent of the explanation that we can provide to you. HUD is increasingly in a position to better respond to grantees' questions and comments in regard to their project. And what we would point out to you is that this, the formation of this cohort and the sequence of webinars, as well as the companion office hours, are that whole approach to providing support and technical assistance is aimed to get you the answers you need. So we would urge you to actively participate and share your questions especially during what I'm referring to as the office hours, because Chad and I will be able to essentially allow everyone who wishes to speak to come off mute, kind of like we have started to do in these sessions, and with the help of grant officers who may not be assigned to your grant but have insight, try to respond to those particular questions. And in that vein, I will point out that we do have a fairly detailed question from Roger, who indicates before I even pose this question that he can't, he won't be able to speak or offer any clarification. But his question, Chad, is what happens when the project team is constrained by HUD funding and all RFP submissions have exceeded the available project budget? The objective is to ensure the project narrative accurately reflects the financial capabilities while still achieving the planning process's objectives and metrics. And then he indicates action. The team seeks advice on adjusting the project narrative to align with the available HUD funding, ensuring it remains consistent with the budget narrative. The question at hand is how to effectively modify the narrative to depict the full scope of work considering the budgetary constraints. I think this detailed issue is exactly the kind of thing that we would hope we could unpack and answer fully in the office hours. If there's any insight, Chad, that you might offer, feel free. But I think in respect to the guidance that we have offered so far is that, and you will later learn in the budget session, to the extent possible, you should describe the narrative of the entire project. Now, if the project is necessarily reduced in size and scope because of a lack of funding, and you do not anticipate fulfilling the original scope, and you've not yet submitted the narrative, it is appropriate for you to make those decisions as the grantee on what is the scope of your project that can be funded either from HUD or whatever sources you've identified, and then describe the entirety of that project and the uses of funds. What you'll hear in the next session on budget is that you are encouraged to provide a sources and uses budget for the entirety of the project. So if, Roger, you were to obtain additional funding besides the HUD funding, you would want to, and thereby maybe restore some of the cuts in scope that you are anticipating making because of the budgetary restraints. You would then want to identify that additional source beyond the HUD funding. But for the project narrative, you mainly want for it to describe the full project in terms that align with the intent of Congress in appropriating funds to your project, and then sufficient so that when you submit the budget, it covers all of the elements of activities, including those that are funded by HUD, so the environmental review can cover the entire scope of your project. And now that you also are aware that the Build America, Buy America Act could affect your project if you have funding other than the CPF that is subject to that act, you would want to identify those sources for the sake of satisfying the BABA requirements where they would apply beyond the waiver given that Chad mentioned in respect to your CPF funding. So, Roger, I hope that you found what I described beneficial. We would probably urge you to get in touch with your grant officer. And I've noticed that there are some who continue to indicate a little frustration in making that contact. One other thing I will mention, and if Chantal is with us still, she could maybe elaborate on this. HUD is looking at how to improve the responsiveness, and there is an instruction that's currently available to you where you are having difficulty, and that is to navigate in the HUD exchange to the AAQ and raise the question there, where that question would immediately be elevated to leadership, who could intervene and better put you in touch with your grant officer.
Hi, Randall. This is Vaughn Watson here with HUD. Chantel had to jump for another call, but I'm able to speak on that. Again, we agree with what Randall's just stated. Again, if you're having some issues with getting in contact with your HUD representative, as Randall indicated, please use the AAQ, and also to raise that question and also let them know that you're having trouble, contact your grant officer. In addition, I would also say when you contact your HUD rep, if you're not your grant officer, if you're not receiving communication from them, also copy the CPF mailbox. We have our system officers team who monitors that. You have a system officers that's assigned to your grant, and they too would elevate that to your grant officer and or leadership of the department if we see that there is consistent non-contact responsiveness to your grant officers. And again, my apologies on behalf of the department if you're finding that we are not being as responsive as we should. But again, feel free to, as Randall indicated, use the AAQ to elevate that question, as well as when you contact your grant officer, copy the CPF mailbox as well, because again, your system officer sees those questions and will be also able to further raise that issue. Randall, if I may, can I just make one comment as it relates to Roger's question?
Certainly, yes.
As it relates to the scope of work, as don't want to get ahead of the presentation, but at best, Randall is correct. You want to address, when you do your scope of work, we understand here at HUD things changes in the process based upon where you're at when you do your scope of work and budget. Again, so we want you to provide us with the most accurate information. Tell us about the totality of the project, and then in that also provide a section that you speak specifically to the CPF funds. And just know on our end, if say you submit your grant packet today, it's February. You're going to fully execute a grant agreement in March, and let's say 6 months down the line, things change. We have an amendment process that's very streamlined, yes, very simple. And again, I'm not going to jump ahead. Randall and then we'll cover that at a later time. But we understand things change, directives change, environmental, different issues and factor changes the project. We have a very streamlined and simple process. So to answer your question, I hope I did, is again, talk about the totality of your project at this point in time, talk how the CPF funds will be utilized and impact your project. And again, from there, if changes are needed, we are very flexible.
Thank you, Vaughn. I think that was very helpful. I do also want to note that Chad has placed in the chat, again, the link to the list of grant officers, as well as other pertinent materials. We recognize that it will take a few days for the slides to be posted to the HUD exchange. And if you're wanting the links that Chad went over and a way to immediately visit the HUD exchange and view some of the additional guidance that we've offered, plus raise a question about the identity of or a response from your grant officer in the AAQ, you can see here where that link appears. The CPF help desk, or AAQ, is the last link in the message that Chad included at 5 minutes past the top of the hour. Chad, what other questions do we have here?
I see one that asks if these grants have a local match requirement. And no, they don't. That one's an easy question.
Yes, that is an easy question.
So,
I want to just add
there.
that is significant in the sense that these appropriations have been resumed only in the recent years, after having been offered throughout recent history. And consequently, it is a special congressional appropriation that what we would hope you all recognize is more likely, once you are awarded the grant, to be used in a fashion where it is subject to far fewer guidelines, rules, and regulations that are pertinent and applicable for many other federal programs, especially those in the Department of HUD. Chad, we have a question from Nicholas about the environmental review officer, and he's a bit confused on how to find the regional environmental officer. You've included the link, and it's actually the same link that contains the names of the grant officers, so you can see which regional environmental officer is assigned to your grant by looking at that single contact list for the grant officers / regional environmental review officer.
Oh, I think Nicholas might be asking about how to determine the responsible entity
on
the environmental
yes.
review.
Okay. Do you want to take that question?
Sure, but it might not be a satisfying answer in that we're going to have a special session related to environmental. This is a four course series, and we're in the first one for narrative.
About a month off. So what I think I'll do is go ahead and at least try to explain this, since it would be necessary for you to cover in the project narrative how your environmental review, first the status of the environmental review. Chad and I both pointed out that you want to answer that question in the project narrative, and you would indicate whether or not you have reached out to a HUD grantee, such as a city, county, or state that receives HUD funding under grant programs such as the Community Development Block Grant, and where you're able to contact City Hall or the county courthouse or the state capitol and gain cooperation from that government entity. They are typically recognized by HUD as the responsible entities, the RE, as you reference under Part 58, which describes the procedures for clearing a project for use of federal funds, where the responsible entity, the grantee or a partner of the grantee, is going to conduct much of that review. There are some situations where you will have difficulty finding any local government or other entity that would be recognized by HUD as a responsible entity. An example would be very remote rural areas out west. And in those instances, and this is more an exception or an unusual circumstance rather than the common one, HUD will work with you as under another part 50, which enables them to conduct the environmental review as the last resort, where a grantee has no other choice. And we are getting ahead of ourselves here. This question will be, and could be posed again a few weeks from now in the environmental session, and answered by actually an official from the office in the Department of HUD that oversees environmental reviews. Other questions, Chad, before you continue?
No, I don't believe so. So let's go to the next slide here. It's a homework assignment. So in preparation for the next cohort meeting, which is going to be about budget, just as a prelude there, we would like you to do some work so that you're prepared for that session and it can be as useful as possible for you. So as you are working on your project narrative and wrapping that up, making sure that it is fully described and mentions any other funding that's going to be pulled in to complete the project, we're asking that you begin to identify what those other sources of funding might be and begin putting together a budget that covers all of those funding sources and the use of all those funding sources. So sources and uses statement for the project. And that will have you in a good position to participate in the budget cohort session. So the next one is budget. It's on February 20th, same time as this one, 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. The two after that are environmental and forms is the last one. And Randall, can you run through how the invites go? Are folks going to get invites to attend the rest of these from the learning management system? Is that correct?
Yes, Chad, that is correct. If you have enrolled in these webinars through the learning management system, the LMS called Absorb, that is operated by TDA Consulting, you will be sent information regarding each of these sessions, as well as the office hours sessions that I mentioned earlier. And those typically are occurring 1 or 2 weeks after the preceding topic is addressed. For example, Chad and I will be doing a project narrative office hours within that time period. And you may have already been invited to attend, and it will be on that occasion where you'll be able to participate in a much more active fashion, where your specific detailed question can be raised. Chad will call on you, unmute your microphone so that you can ask clarifying questions. He and I will try to respond and kind of discuss and to a certain extent troubleshoot those questions. You'll also have the benefit of not one grant officer like Vaughn Watson, but 2 or 3 who are familiar with the wide range of circumstances that can arise. I want to point out right now that the kind of workaround that I think Eric suggested, it probably deserves me mentioning it, a thought, a response, and emphasize the value of attending the office hours session. He notes, I think with a degree of frustration, that if any questions arise about a misalignment between your project description and the joint explanatory statement in the congressional record, that is the intent of Congress for the appropriations of your funds, is it not, I'm quoting now, is it not better to put that in the supplemental data? And I'm gathering what he would mean to suggest there is, and then go ahead and submit your project narrative that fixes any ambiguity, rather than ask the grant officer for guidance. He's indicated that his experience is that it's been difficult to interact and gain clear direction. What I would point out is the office hours will offer an opportunity to have an exchange that is beyond just your grant officer, but with other grant officers and possibly officials like Chantal, who is the deputy director for the office that oversees this program, who can really give you a more authoritative answer to your question. But as a general rule, I have to point out that it's vitally important that your project description align with the intent of Congress. As HUD is the administrator of the CPF program, it is required under federal law to carry out the intent of Congress in the appropriation of funds. In that example, where Bertram Gardens project description read that they were going to build the fish hatchery education complex on land that had already been provided to them, and then the intent of Congress's $2 million appropriation was to fund the land acquisition, that was a misalignment. And what it would have prevented is executing that grant agreement, and it would hold up the use of that $2 million for an extended period of time. And Bertram Gardens would have been in worse shape than if they had taken the correct action of contacting their grant officer and proceeding then to change the description and perhaps recognize what might have occurred in the intervening time period. You may remember that they had a partner that essentially operates the estuary where the fish hatchery is located. And apparently that other partner decided to donate the land. But in the meantime, Congress had appropriated funds for a project that seemed to require a site for that educational complex. And consequently, there was a misalignment, and it became necessary for a technical correction to occur in order for that appropriation to then result in a grant package for which the agreement could be entered into, and then Bertram Gardens draw funds from within DRGR to complete their $2 million education complex. So we would urge you to be sure and respond to the notification you receive from Absorb and attend both the budget session that Chad's sharing with you here, as well as the subsequent sessions that will occur on other topics, plus the related office hours sessions where you'll be able to, and in the case of Eric, we can revisit your detailed issues, those of Roger and others who have posed interesting questions that do require a fuller discussion before a clear answer can be provided by the participants in the office hours. Chad, do you see anything, or did you hear anything that I said that you'd like to add to or clarify?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Okay. I will go back.
Randall, you still there?
I am. Did you want to go ahead and advance the slide?
Yes. So the last slide, second to last slide here, you've got Randall and my contact information. If you have any questions about the presentation material or something that we said, don't hesitate to reach out.
Chad, before we end here,
I
do see that we have a few other questions, and this may have been triggered by what I had just said in respect to the importance of the joint explanatory statement. I believe, didn't you place the link to the JES and the laws in the chat?
I did. Yep.
Yeah, it's at the HUD Exchange. And I think that if you can locate that at 3:23 p.m. Eastern time, Chad did indicate that you can find that information under the laws and regulations part of the CPF website on the HUD Exchange. And let me forewarn you, whoever is looking at that resource, it's the congressional record, and it is a very lengthy document. You are provided with the page numbers, a range of numbers that cover the appropriations and the annual budget appropriations act, which relate to the community project funding, and your award is organized according to state and alphabetically, and so you should be able to look through there and find what you're trying to locate. And we have Robert asking, can you share those emails again? So could you go back to our email addresses?
Yep,
Chad?
I just did, and he got them.
Oh, he got them. Okay,
Yep.
I'm a step behind you.
No worries.
All right, I think those are the only few remaining questions that we had.
All right. So lastly, evaluations. We aim for these to be effective, these presentations to be effective tools for you, and we get better with your feedback. So please take a moment to complete the evaluation on this session. You'll get an email from cohorts at tdainc.org with a link to the evaluation, or you can scan that QR code that's on the screen right now. Please take a moment to fill it out. Tell us how we did, how we can do better. We appreciate it. And that is a wrap. Thank you all so much for giving us some of your time today. Hope it was helpful, and
yes, indeed.
See you at office hours.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.